Alright, welcome back guys. Thanks for joining me on my investing journey. I really hope you guys get some useful information, entertainment, or at least inspiration out of these videos. There's a couple of things I want to talk about in today's video. The first one is an update on my portfolio because I did finally sell jepi. This follows my previous video on this channel where I was talking about and giving my explanation behind selling jepi. And as expected, there's lots of divisiveness in the comments, and I want to quickly give an update, a few clarifications on why I made this switch. Following that, I want to give a quick explainer on the biggest misconception I had about dividend investing back when I was new to it. And it's all about the compounding process and yield on cost. And then following that, I want to quickly touch on Apple's pretty groundbreaking savings account, offering an APY of 4.15%. This is a pretty big deal considering it's coming from Apple, and it's giving the masses, probably for the first time, an easy way to earn an actual meaningful amount on their money. So we're going to talk more about that as well as my thoughts on it later on in the video. If you guys end up enjoying the content, I appreciate a like, subscribing, and let's get into this. Okay, so coming to my activity page here, we can see that on April 19th, I sold all of my jepi position, and I converted most of that into XYLG. Now, jepi is an extremely popular ETF, so I knew that this decision was going to be very divisive. And I want to say right off the bat that I think jepi, for a derivatives-based income ETF, is one of the highest quality options in the market, especially if you want a very high dividend yield. But the reason why I made the switch is for two core reasons. One is just my personal portfolio. jepi just never fit into it that well. And the second point, I also view the switch as de-risking my portfolio. So on the first point, when it comes to the performance, XYLG simply has more price appreciation characteristics to it versus jepi. It is way more defensive in nature, which is something people love about jepi, but in this regard, Divo is more defensive. So you can see how through this view, jepi is kind of this awkward middle ground. It's not that growthy and it's not that defensive. And with the way my portfolio is set up, I much rather have XYLG and Divo working together in combination with my other holdings rather than just having everything invested in jepi. So that's my first point on the performance and how different funds kind of work and complement each other. The second point on de-risking, I believe XYLG is substantially less risky than jepi, even though jepi is a low volatility fund. So if you guys follow the channel, you know that XYLG is a very hands-off ETF. It follows the S&P 500 index exactly with a systematic covered call writing strategy overlaying it. I've recently learned that the parent company of this ETF, due to them using a clearinghouse, there's also no counterparty risk associated with these derivatives. And they also don't use any leverage. So putting this all together for an ETF that uses derivatives, there's no counterparty risk, there's no leverage, and the whole thing is systematic. I like all of those things. Now, jepi, on the other hand, is much more opaque in nature, and we don't know all of the inner workings of the ELNs and the whole ETF in general. The first red flag here is only 20% of jepi is invested in the ELNs, which generate the income of the fund, or at least the vast majority of the income of jepi. But somehow, even though just 20% is invested in these ELNs, the overall dividend yield of jepi is over 11% at the current moment. For reference, XYLG covers half of the S&P 500 with covered calls, so that split is 50%, larger than the 20% in ELNs, and yet the dividend yield is only 6%. So I'm coming to the conclusion here that the ELNs must, in my calculations, use some form of leverage. And again, jepi is very opaque here, but I did find this deep in one of the documents stating that the derivatives may be sensitive to changes in economic market conditions and may create leverage, which could result in losses that significantly exceed the fund's original investment. The fund may be more volatile than if the fund had not been leveraged, because leverage tends to exaggerate any effect on the value of the fund's portfolio securities. And then they go on to say that certain derivatives expose the fund to counterparty risk as well. So they don't explicitly say the ELNs use leverage, but they say that they could create leverage. So due to all this uncertainty, as well as the unproven nature of ELNs in general, I view XYLG as just a safer dividend-based ETF than jepi in my estimation. So I'm very comfortable having XYLG in my portfolio. I'm going to keep a close tab on it, see how it performs, how the dividend behaves over time. And if I like it and it performs as I expect it should, trailing pretty closely behind the S&P 500 with a pretty consistent and growing dividend over time, then I might replace BST with XYLG in the future as well. But I'm going to take it slowly, and first we're going to see how XYLG performs over a long period of time. Okay, now moving on, I want to address a point of confusion that I know I personally had when I was more new to dividend investing. And it had to do with how dividend companies compound over time and things like the yield on cost. So if you ever use a dividend growth calculator, you've definitely seen this category, yield on cost, and over just a short span of time, like 10, 15 years, the yield on cost these dividend growth companies can produce is insane. And I once viewed this as part of the magic of dividend investing. Once you get the ball rolling, it's that snowball effect. And as long as you don't disrupt it and sell out of the company, this compounding growth is the seventh wonder of the world. And while it is true that dividend growth companies do indeed compound over time, this whole yield on cost measurement and never selling out of a dividend company because then this whole process gets restarted isn't as dire as I originally thought it was. So for example, 5 years ago, SCHD was trading at a share price of $48 per share. So if you bought 10,000 bucks worth of SCHD 5 years ago, you would have 208 shares, and that would have paid you $340 per year in dividend income. And today, 5 years later, those same 208 shares will be paying you $507 of income. This brings your yield on cost from 3.4% to 5% in just 5 years. If you buy that same amount of SCHD today at a share price of $73, you'd only have an annual income of $334. So there's this huge gap simply by having held on to SCHD for a longer period of time. And I thought that because of the dividend growth nature that this difference was insurmountable and you can never make up for lost time. And it also explained why you should never sell a dividend growth stock, because you would be ending this compounding process. And while it is true that dividend investments do compound very nicely over time, this whole thing's based off of a false premise. We're assuming that over this 5-year period of time that if we don't buy the dividend stock, then that $10,000 of capital is just sitting idly by doing nothing. The better question would be, okay, what happens if over that time we invested in a growth asset like the S&P 500 that historically returns about 10% per year? So this isn't a dividend growth investment, it's just a vessel providing a competitive rate of return over the same time period. So in this case, that 10,000 bucks returned into just over $16,000. So now if we take that $16,000 and buy SCHD at the current share price, that would give us 220 shares and provide $536 of annual income. And that's almost identical to the current amount of income SCHD would be paying you if you bought into it 5 years ago. So the takeaway here, simply being invested in something that has competitive total returns is ultimately what matters the most. And while the yield on cost is a real thing, you shouldn't be misled by it. An example of this is don't not sell a dividend stock that you're changing your mind on simply because you have a yield on cost of 10%. By selling it, you're not stopping the compounding process as long as you redeploy it in other productive assets. And to finish off the video, we need to talk about Apple's new high yield savings account offering a whopping 4.15% APY. And so of course, this is an extremely competitive APY. If we do a search for the best high yield savings accounts, these are the current rates on the market. I see a lot of 3.9, 3.75, and the highest here is 4.75. So Apple being 4.15 isn't the absolute highest on the market, but it's definitely amongst the best of high yield savings accounts. It's even better than the APY that M1 Finance, my brokerage, offers in their checking account. But unlike M1, they're actually using a large, much safer bank, which you would expect from a company like Apple. So starting today, Apple Card users can choose to grow their daily cash rewards with a savings account from Goldman Sachs, which offers that high yield of 4.15%. If you scroll down to the fine print, this 4.15% APY is variable and it can change at any given moment. So do keep that in mind. Right now, the interest rate is very high, but it's likely that within a year or two, that number will be coming down pretty drastically And in that scenario, this is probably also going to decline pretty fast. But still, overall, this is an awesome product offering an APY to millions of customers of 4.15%. That's much more competitive than the likes of JP Morgan, Bank of America, and what most people are used to. And let me know in the comments, are you guys going to be taking advantage of this new feature? I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, I appreciate a like, subscribing for future content, and I'll see you guys in the next one.